Most co-founder splits don't start with the screaming match. They start with hundreds of conversations where you were both speaking but solving completely different things, and neither of you even knew it at the time. And that gap, it doesn't show up in your metrics, at least not initially. It shows up like 6 months later whenever it's way more expensive to fix and everyone has already picked a side. Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Jones, and I help co-founding teams fix exactly that before it costs them their company. Now, there's a clear structural reason this co-founder drift happens. And I developed a model that I call the three languages all teams speak. And in a minute, I'm going to walk you through those three layers, including the one that almost no founding team knows exists. But first, let me just briefly share why most co-founding teams get stuck. See, most communication advice for founding teams focuses on frequency and format, right? Things like have more regular check-ins, use nonviolent communication, don't let things fester. And that advice isn't wrong necessarily, but it's aimed at the wrong layer of the problem. Most co-founder communication isn't really about how often you talk. It's about the level of conversation you're actually having. So let me bring up this image for you. Picture with your mind communication as an iceberg, right? So the tip is what's visible, right? It's explicit, it's measurable, it's quantifiable, and yet the vast majority of that structure is below the surface. And that's where the complex meaning lives. And that's where most of the unresolved issues quietly accumulate. So, founding teams that I talk to every day spend 98%, if not more, of every single conversation at the tip of the iceberg because that operational layer, it's urgent, it's important, it's what the company needs from you today. And dropping below the surface into the deeper layers of communication takes time and psychological safety that most teams haven't deliberately built. So I'm going to walk you through my model of the three languages all teams speak, and I want to start with the top, that tip of the iceberg called operational language. So operational language includes tasks, timelines, deliverables, decisions, logistics, right? It's what we're building, when does it ship, who's responsible, what did we decide last week? Like all of that is operational language, and the language is really efficient. It's something that every single founding team needs to be fluent in. The problem with operational language is when it becomes the default for all challenging conversations. Whenever you start using operational language to avoid emotional discomfort, that's whenever it's problematic because it may feel safe in the moment because it doesn't require vulnerability. But that's actually its trap, right? Because it feels like you're making this forward momentum whenever you're not addressing the difficult dynamics under the surface that are causing those business level communications to not be so effective. So here's like the tell, like the way to think about this. Operational language is problematic when it gets used to avoid a conversation that actually needs to happen somewhere else. So if you were to say, hey, look, let's just focus on the launch, whenever the real issue is unspoken resentment that neither of you have named, that's a problem. Or let's just table this conversation until after the board meeting, right? When the real issue is that the two of you have fundamentally different versions of the company and neither of you want to find that out yet, right? That type of avoidance is part of the problem, where I see a lot of founding teams get stuck because that operational content is always real and it's always important, but it's also being used defensively, and that makes it far less effective and efficient. And so that's exactly where the next layer comes in. So the second layer of conversation is psychological language. This is that layer just below the surface. And so this has to do with the emotional dynamics, relational identity, like those deeper components of the conversation. And so when you start shifting from operational to psychological language, you're starting to investigate, how am I actually feeling about what's happening internally and interpersonally between us? What am I afraid of in this decision? And where does that fear come from? Right? Like what do I need from this partnership that I'm not currently getting? This language, in other words, requires slowing down and greater emotional presence. And in that way, it uses more emotional resources. And it requires, therefore, psychological safety, this implicit agreement that what we say whenever we're using psychological language won't be weaponized in a later conversation in a different room or in a different argument. Unfortunately, most founders avoid this layer. And I think part of that's because of startup culture. It's spent years sort of telling them that emotional content is just noise, it's something to manage privately and not to bring into the room. The problem with that framing is that suppressed emotion doesn't disappear. It just relocates. It shifts. It shows up in passive aggressive Slack comments, or a unilateral decision that just so happens to, kind of minimize your co-founder's contribution or decision-making authority, or a board meeting where you're both performing this alignment that you actually stopped feeling 6 months ago, right? Like there's a lot of unspoken emotional dynamics, and I guess that leads me to the next layer here, and this is the one that most founders don't even know exists. This is archetypal language. Archetypal language is the language of the unconscious. It is the foundation, the deepest layer. I personally just call it the vibe. So if you've ever been part of a high performing team, you know what it's like to row in the same direction at the same cadence, to have that shared goals, shared responsibilities, clear roles, and that sense that everyone in the room is pulling for that exact same outcome. And if you've been part of a low performing team, or if you've been in a difficult relationship or co-founder dynamic, like you know what the opposite feels like. Whenever you see their Slack message come through and you feel a little sick to your stomach, or you're kind of walking and tiptoeing and trying to say the right thing in a meeting because you don't want to like come down too hard, or whatever the case may be, and you start over explaining your decisions that really you shouldn't have to justify. And so you're expending an insane amount of energy on a relationship, uh, instead of the company, or instead of other things to make your life more fulfilling. And that palpable lived experience of what it's like to be in relationship with another person, that's our archetypal language. And here's what makes it so operationally important. Most founding teams just try to solve those archetypal dynamics and those, psychological interpersonal dynamics at the operational language. So they'll come up with, new frameworks, new communication protocols, new meeting cadences, all while the actual thing creating the problem in the partnership is an unspoken emotional dynamic that no one has the courage to name aloud. And when it becomes visible, you can work with it, you can start to change it. But if it remains invisible and implicit rather than explicit in the partnership, it's going to continue exerting kind of force and shaping your interactions. And in particular, your operational conversations get stuck in these recurring disagreements, and it's really ineffective. And so I guess it raises a question, which is, how can you know which of these three levels you're stuck in? Well, next time you're experiencing some frustration, like one of those recurring difficult conversations, or strategic disagreement, or you're unsure exactly hiring, firing, like any of these common issues, I would recommend that you pause and recognize that there is some type of mismatch happening. The reason it's so inefficient is because you're not using the correct language. That is a clear telltale sign. And so you can ask yourself, what language are we using right now? But the data is already right in front of you. There's already something that is indicating a degree of friction, because otherwise things would typically move and progress relatively smoothly. And so that leads me to my overarching point, which is matching the language you're using to the level of the problem is one of the most underused skills in co-founding team communication. It's also one of the highest leverage unlocks, right? Like the founding teams who can do this, who can deliberately shift from a operational level conversation or a strategic conversation, and say, oh, actually, I'm noticing that we're getting a bit stuck here. Why don't we shift to psychological language and switch to reflective dialogue and reflective listening? And in fact, why don't you share your thoughts? Okay, I'll mirror those back. Okay, now let me state consensus. Let me validate. Okay, now here's my opinion. The teams who can do that and then return to operational level processing are able to move far more efficiently and far faster than the teams who don't have that skill set. And so my book will walk through this model in a whole lot of detail and add some of the practical tools you need to be moving all between those three languages intentionally, rather than getting stuck and just defaulting to one. And so I highly recommend picking that up. And so your co-founder relationship is unquestionably the most important relationship in your business, and it's too important to leave to chance. So please subscribe and grab the co-founder effect below, and I'll show you exactly what to do with it.